I don't need you anymore.
He looked her in the eyes after everything she had done for him and said just 4 words, "I don't need you anymore." And in that moment, something inside Emily Carter broke in a way that no one around her could see, because heartbreak like that is quiet. It does not always scream. It settles deep in your chest and stays there long after the person who caused it is gone. She stood frozen, trying to understand how 5 years of loyalty, sacrifice, and belief could end in a sentence so cold it felt rehearsed. She was pregnant, broke alone, and the man she trusted most, Daniel Brooks, walked away without looking back. But what he didn't know was that in just a few months, she wouldn't just survive, she would own everything he ever worked for. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because this story is not just about betrayal, it is about power timing and the kind of transformation most people only believe exists in fiction. Yet stories like this have happened more times than we think, where the person who was once overlooked, dismissed, and abandoned becomes the very person everyone answers to. And Emily Carter was about to become exactly that kind of story. Emily Carter grew up in a quiet part of Ohio, raised by a single father, Richard Carter, a man who rarely spoke about his work and even more rarely showed emotion. He was present but distant, the kind of parent who provided everything except closeness. And as Emily grew older, that distance shaped her in ways she did not fully understand. She became someone who gave too much in relationships, and hoping to receive in return what she never fully got at home: stability, attention, reassurance. And when she met Daniel Brooks at a small networking event in Chicago, he seemed like the answer to everything she had been missing. He was ambitious, charming, and carried himself like someone who knew exactly where he was going, even though at the time he had very little to show for it. Daniel talked about building a company that would change lives. He spoke about freedom, success, and proving people wrong, and Emily believed him not because he had results, but because she saw potential. And for someone like her, potential was enough. She supported him from the very beginning, working long hours as a marketing assistant, while Daniel spent nights developing ideas, pitching investors, and chasing a future that had not yet taken shape. She paid the bills covered, a rent, and even took out a small personal loan to help him launch his first product, something he promised would be temporary support until everything took off. And for a while, it seemed like it was working. The company began to gain traction. Small wins turned into bigger opportunities, and Daniel started getting noticed in business circles that once ignored him. But as his success grew, something else began to change. Something less visible at first, but impossible to ignore. Over time, his tone shifted. Conversations became shorter. Appreciation faded into expectation, and the same woman who once inspired him slowly became someone he treated like part of his past rather than his future. By the time Emily discovered she was pregnant, Daniel had already started pulling away emotionally. He spent more nights out, more time on his phone, and less time. Acknowledging the life they had built together, she tried to talk to him, tried to remind him of where they started, but every conversation seemed to end the same way, with him distracted, dismissive, or simply uninterested, until the night everything finally came to the surface when she saw a message on his phone that confirmed what her instincts had been telling her for weeks. He was seeing someone else, and when confronted, he did not deny it. He did not even try to soften the truth. He simply looked at her with a calmness that felt almost calculated and said he had outgrown the relationship, as if love was something you could measure and discard once it no longer matched your ambition. Emily told him about the pregnancy, hoping it would change something in him, awaken some sense of responsibility or memory of who they used to be. But instead of hesitation or concern, he responded with indifference, telling her to deal with it as if she were facing the situation alone, and in that moment she realized she was. He packed his things and left without looking back, leaving behind not just a relationship, but a woman standing at the lowest point of her life with no clear direction and no support system to rely on. The days that followed were filled with silence, the kind that makes time feel heavier. Each passing hour, a reminder of everything that had been lost. She struggled to keep up with rent. Her savings quickly disappeared, and the future she once imagined with Daniel was replaced by uncertainty and fear. Yet even in that darkness, something began to shift slowly at first. Almost unnoticeable, but powerful enough to change everything that came next, because sometimes the moment everything falls apart is the same moment something else begins to take shape, something stronger, more focused, and far less dependent on anyone else. And for Emily Carter, that shift was about to begin in a way neither she nor Daniel could have predicted. One morning, just as she was trying to figure out how to stretch what little money she had left, her phone rang, with a number she did not recognize. She almost ignored it, assuming it was another bill collector or service provider calling to remind her of payments she could not make. But something made her answer, and on the other end of the line was a voice that spoke with a level of formality she had not heard in a long time, asking to confirm her identity before delivering news that would change everything. Her father, Richard Carter, had passed away. The words felt distant, like they were meant for someone else. Because despite their complicated relationship, he was still her father, and hearing about his death created a mix of emotions she was not prepared to process: grief, confusion, and a quiet sense of regret for all the conversations they never had. But what came next was something she could not have imagined. The caller informed her that she had been named the sole beneficiary of his estate, and when she hesitantly asked what that meant, the response was direct. Her father was not just a private man. He was a highly successful businessman who owned multiple companies across different industries, with a net worth estimated in the billions, and suddenly, everything Emily thought she knew about her past was incomplete. The man she believed had lived a modest life had in reality built an empire, one that she was now set to inherit, and in that moment, the same. A woman who had been abandoned, broke and uncertain, found herself standing at the beginning of a completely different reality. One where survival was no longer the goal, and something far greater was within reach. As the legal process unfolded, Emily was introduced to a world she had never been part of: meetings with attorneys, financial advisors, and executives who spoke about her father with a level of respect she had never witnessed during his lifetime. She learned about the companies he owned, the influence he held, and the decisions he made that quietly shaped industries without public attention. And among those companies was one that immediately caught her attention because it was deeply connected to her past. It was the company Daniel Brooks now worked for, the same company he believed he was helping build, the same company he often spoke about. With pride, never realizing that the foundation he stood on was already shifting in ways he could not see. Emily listened carefully as details were explained, not reacting outwardly, but internally processing the irony of the situation. The man who once told her he did not need her was now unknowingly working under the control of the very person he abandoned. And as the weeks passed, Emily began to change, not in a way that was loud or dramatic, but in a way that was steady, intentional, and grounded in a new understanding of her own value. She took the time to learn the business, understand the operations, and build relationships with the people who would now be part of her daily life. She was no longer the woman waiting for someone else to validate her worth. She was becoming someone who defined it for herself, and with that shift came clarity. Not about a revenge, but about control over her own story and how it would be written moving forward. Emily Carter did not rush into her new reality because sudden power without understanding often leads to the same kind of mistakes that destroy people who never expected to have it in the first place. And what made her different was not just what she had inherited, but how she chose to approach it. She spent weeks observing more than speaking, sitting in meetings where executives outlined strategies that had been in motion long before she arrived, listening to discussions about acquisitions, growth projections, and internal restructuring, while quietly building a picture of how everything connected and where her place would be within it, because she understood something that many people in her position overlook. Authority is not proven by how quickly you assert, but by how well you understand what you control. And Emily was determined to understand every detail before making a single decision that would define her leadership. She studied reports late into the night, balancing her time between learning the business and preparing for the life she was about to bring into the world, a life that would depend on her ability to turn this unexpected inheritance into something stable, secure, and meaningful. And in those quiet moments, she reflected on everything that had happened, not with anger, but with clarity, because the pain Daniel left behind had already done its job. It had forced her to grow in ways she might never have chosen. But now that growth was becoming something she could rely on rather than something she had to recover from, Daniel Brooks, on the other hand, was living in a completely different version of reality, one that still revolved around the belief that he was in control of his future. His position in the company had improved over the past year. He was gaining recognition for his work and had begun to see himself as someone who was essential to the organization, someone whose ideas were shaping the direction of the business. And while some of that confidence was earned, much of it was built on assumptions he had never been forced to question, because success had come quickly and without the kind of resistance that reveals weaknesses. He moved through his days with a sense of certainty that bordered on arrogance, attending meetings where he spoke more than he listened and making decisions that were approved without much pushback, largely because the structure above him remained unchanged, or so he believed. He had no reason to think. That ownership had shifted no reason to suspect that the person now reviewing high-level reports and approving strategic moves was someone he once dismissed so easily, and as a result he continued forward unaware that the ground beneath him was already changing in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. As Emily became more comfortable in her role, she began to take a closer look at the company Daniel was part of, not out of personal interest at first, but because it was one of the more active divisions within her father's portfolio. It had shown rapid growth, but also signs of imbalance, areas where expansion had outpaced structure and where leadership decisions were being made without long-term consideration. She reviewed performance metrics, internal feedback, and financial patterns, noticing inconsistencies that suggested the company's current trajectory was not as stable as it appeared from the outside. And rather than react immediately, she chose to gather more context, requesting detailed reports from department heads and scheduling one-on-one conversations with key figures within the organization, including Daniel Brooks, whose name appeared frequently in both positive and concerning contexts. And when his profile came across her desk, she paused, not because she was surprised to see it there, but because it marked the first moment where her past and present would directly intersect in a way that required careful thought. She knew that whatever decision she made moving forward needed to be grounded in fairness rather than emotion, because the position she held now demanded a level of discipline that left no room for personal bias. Yet she also understood that this situation was not something she could avoid indefinitely. It was something she would have to face directly and with clarity. The announcement of new ownership within the company was handled with precision, a formal communication sent out to all employees outlining the transition and setting expectations for the coming months. It did not include personal details about Emily or her connection to the previous owner. It simply introduced her as the new head of the organization and emphasized a commitment to continuity, stability, and thoughtful growth. And while most employees received the news with a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism, Daniel viewed it as an opportunity rather than a disruption. He saw new leadership as a chance to position himself even higher within the company, to align his work with the priorities of someone who might recognize his value more clearly than those before. And in the days leading up to the first executive meeting under the new ownership, he prepared extensively, reviewing his recent projects, refining his presentations, and anticipating questions that might allow him to stand out among his peers. He had no reason to think that the meeting would be anything other than a standard introduction, followed by discussions about future direction. But as he entered the building that morning, There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, something quieter, more focused, as if the organization itself was preparing for a change that extended beyond strategy and into something more personal, for at least one person in the room. Emily arrived early, taking her place at the head of the conference table before anyone else entered the room. She reviewed her notes one last time, not because I doubted her preparation, but because she understood the importance of this moment. It was not just her first formal appearance as the owner, it was the beginning of how she would be perceived by those who would work under her leadership, and perception in environments like this often determines how effectively decisions are received and implemented. She chose her words carefully, structured her approach to balance authority with openness, and waited as the room gradually filled with executives and managers, each taking their seats and exchanging brief introductions among themselves until the final person walked in. Daniel Brooks entered with the same confidence he carried into every meeting. His posture relaxed, his expression composed until his eyes met hers, and in that instant, everything changed. The recognition was immediate and undeniable. The past and present collided in a way that left no space for confusion, and for a brief moment the room felt smaller, as if the air itself had shifted around them, but Emily did not react. She maintained her composure, allowing the silence to pass naturally, before beginning the meeting with a calm introduction that acknowledged the transition without drawing attention to anything beyond the professional context. She outlined her vision for the company, spoke about the importance of sustainable growth, and emphasized the need for accountability at every level. And as she spoke, Daniel sat in stillness, processing the reality of what he was seeing, trying to reconcile the woman he had left behind with the one now leading the room. And by the time the meeting ended, one thing had become clear to him in a way that required no explanation. The person he once had dismissed had become someone he could no longer ignore. After the meeting, Daniel approached her not immediately, but with hesitation, waiting until the room had cleared enough to make the interaction feel less visible to others. He called her name softly, as if unsure whether he had the right to say it at all, and when she turned to face him, there was no anger in her expression, no visible trace of the pain he had caused, only a calm presence that made it difficult for him to find the words he had prepared, because everything he thought he would say now felt inadequate in the face of what she had become. He began with an apology, not fully formed, not entirely confident, but genuine, in its attempt to acknowledge the past, yet Emily did not interrupt. She listened without reacting, allowing him to finish before responding in a tone that was measured and, all clear. She explained that her role required her to evaluate performance based on results, not history, that whatever existed between them would not influence the decisions she made moving forward, and that if he wished to remain part of the organization, his work would need to meet the same standards expected of everyone else. There was no hostility in her words, only a boundary that left no room for misunderstanding. And as she concluded the conversation, she returned to her responsibilities without looking back, leaving Daniel standing in a position he had never experienced before, one where he was no longer in control of how the story between them would unfold. In the weeks that followed, Emily began implementing changes across the company, not drastic shifts that would disrupt operations, but strategic adjustments designed to strengthen areas that had been overlooked. She restructured reporting lines, introduced clearer performance metrics, and created channels for communication that allowed concerns to surface before they became larger issues. And while these changes were received positively by many, they also revealed weaknesses in certain departments, including those where Daniel had significant influence. His projects, which once moved forward without much scrutiny, were now subject to detailed review. His decisions analyzed not just for immediate results, but for long-term impact. And while he initially attempted to maintain his usual approach, it quickly became clear that the environment had changed. Expectations were higher, accountability was consistent, and assumptions were no longer enough to justify outcomes. And for the first time since he began his rise within the company, Daniel found of himself having to adapt rather than lead, to listen rather than speak, and to prove rather than assume. And in that process, he began to see aspects of his own behavior that he had previously ignored, recognizing patterns of overconfidence and moments where he had prioritized recognition over responsibility. And while this realization was uncomfortable, it also presented an opportunity, one that required him to confront not just his professional approach, but the personal choices that had shaped the path he was now on. Emily continued to balance her responsibilities with the demands of her personal life, preparing for the arrival of her child, while managing an organization that required constant attention. She built a support system around her not out of necessity alone, but as a deliberate choice to ensure that both aspects of her life received the care they deserved. She surrounded herself with individuals who respected her position and contributed to her growth, people who offered perspective rather than flattery, and who understood that leadership is not about isolation, but about collaboration, guided by clear direction. And as her confidence grew, so did her ability to navigate complex situations with composure, making decisions that reflected both her values and the responsibilities she carried. And through it all, she maintained a level of consistency that became one of her defining traits. She did not react impulsively. She did not allow past experiences to dictate present actions. And she did not seek validation from those who once failed to see her worth. Instead, she focused on building something that would stand on its own, independent of any narrative that came before it. Months passed, and the company began to show signs of stronger alignment. Performance, improved internal communication became more effective, and the culture shifted toward one that valued clarity and accountability over assumption and hierarchy. And within this environment, Daniel's role continued to evolve. He faced challenges that required him to reassess his approach to leadership, to take ownership of decisions in a way that went beyond surface-level success, and to engage with his work from a place of responsibility rather than recognition. And while the transition was not easy, it was necessary. It forced him to develop skills he had previously neglected and to confront aspects of himself that had contributed to both his rise and his missteps. And over time, he began to change, not in a dramatic way, but in a manner that reflected genuine growth. He became more attentive, more deliberate in his decisions, and more aware of the impact his actions had on those around him. And while this change did not erase the past, it did alter the trajectory of his future, creating a version of himself that was more aligned with the standards now expected within the organization. The day Emily gave birth marked a moment that redefined her priorities, not by reducing her ambition, but by deepening her sense of purpose. Holding her child for the first time, she understood that everything she had built and everything she would continue to build carried a meaning that extended beyond personal achievement. It was about creating stability, opportunity, and a legacy that reflected the strength it took to move forward when everything seemed uncertain. And as she returned to her role after a brief period of rest, she did so with a renewed clarity, balancing her responsibilities with a level of focus that allowed her to remain present in both aspects of her life without compromising either. And in the months that followed, she continued to guide the company through its next phase of growth, making decisions that positioned it for long-term success, while maintaining the principles that had shaped her leadership from the beginning. Daniel observed these changes from a different perspective, now no longer seeing Emily through the lens of their past, but as the leader she had become. And while there were moments where he reflected on what could have been, he did not allow those thoughts to define his actions moving forward. He focused on his role within the company, on the opportunities that still existed, and on the possibility of building something meaningful within the structure she had created. And while their interactions remained professional, there was an unspoken understanding between them, one that acknowledged the history they shared without allowing it to interfere with the present. And in that space, both of them continued to grow, not in relation to each other, but in alignment with the paths they had chosen independently. In the end, Emily did not need to prove anything to Daniel or to anyone else. Her success was not defined by comparison or by the reversal of roles that had once placed her in a position of vulnerability. It was defined by her ability to move forward with clarity, to build something sustainable, and to remain grounded in the values that carried her through the most difficult moments of her life. And Daniel, for his part, came to understand that success without perspective is incomplete, that the decisions made in moments of confidence can shape outcomes in ways that are not immediately visible, and that growth often requires confronting the very choices one would prefer to forget.